And then suddenly we come down to the resurrection of Jesus. It's so petty, it's so trivial, it's so local, it's so earthbound, it's so unworthy of the universe.
Hey, welcome back to the channel. Genuinely glad you're here for this one because this might be one of the most intellectually charged conversations I put on this channel in a long time. We have Richard Dawkins, one of the most recognized voices in modern atheism and evolutionary biology, sitting across from John Lennox, a mathematician and philosopher from Oxford, who happens to be a committed Christian. These two are not just disagreeing about religion, they are disagreeing about the very foundation of how human beings understand reality, morality, and existence itself. And the way this exchange builds toward the end is something I did not see coming. Do yourself a favor and stay all the way through. The moment this whole thing crystallizes is not at the beginning. And if you leave early, you will genuinely miss the most important part of this reaction. Also, I am really curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far this reaches, and it honestly means a lot every time I read those. All right, let's get into it.
Well, I think I'd like to make a comment on what Richard just said, because I think you are talking about two different things. My point was this, that if you believe that the universe is at bottom, there's no good and evil, you remove from yourself the categories you're using to discuss morality. That's my point. You're assuming it's true. I'm arguing on the basis of its truth that you're removing those categories, and therefore you leave yourself powerless to comment.
Right. You make a good point that I've removed any absolute standard of morality. The empirical fact, however, is that we all very largely share what we regard as morality. And that's a very interesting
goes
fact.
Much further than that. If that's what you meant, you should have written.
Well, I kind of
there's
did.
no good or evil is a very strong absolutist statement, I would have thought.
How about...
But I want to refer to this.
How about the topic?
Let me say something about this thesis, about the person of Jesus and so on. Again, I have concerns about the God delusion in its treatment of the authority and reliability of Scripture. Because those who've studied it in detail, and I see reference to very few scholars in his book, have come to the conclusion that, say, for example, the historian Luke is one of the most authoritative historians of all ancient history. And Sherwin White of Oxford, a Roman historian, says that it would be absurd to suggest that Luke's basic historicity was false, even in matters of detail. And I'm concerned too, not only about your attitude to history, Richard, but your description of Jesus as belonging to a person who practiced an in-group morality and out-group hostility, and your interpretation of love your neighbor, which I note doesn't come from a theologian, but from an anesthesiologist. And I think he just might have put you to sleep a little bit as you read it, because in Leviticus, which quotes love your neighbors yourself, just a bit further down, it says, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who lives with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, because you were strangers in Egypt. So in point of historicity, you are totally wrong about the attitude of Jesus. In fact, I would have thought you'd have been very familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in that parable, it was a Samaritan, one of the strangers, that showed mercy. And that was precisely the parable that Jesus taught to illustrate the love your neighbor as yourself of Leviticus. Now, a mistake like that seems to me to be very serious indeed. I mean, I react to it a bit like this. What would you think if I got all my views on Darwin from an engineer and never bothered to read The Origin of Species? I think you would be distressed by that.
This is the moment where John Lennox thinks he has Richard Dawkins cornered. And I need you to pay close attention to what he actually does here, because it's one of the most revealing moves in this entire exchange. John opens by saying that if you believe there's no good and evil at the bottom of the universe, you've removed the very categories you need to even talk about morality. And listen, on the surface, that sounds like a strong point. It genuinely does. But here's what people don't realize. Richard never said morality doesn't exist in practice. He said it has no absolute foundation outside of human experience. Those are two completely different claims, and John is treating them as if they're the same thing. That's not a rebuttal. That's a misread. You have to understand what's actually happening in this kind of debate. When someone takes your position, reshapes it into something slightly different, and then argues against that version instead, that is one of the oldest moves in philosophical discourse. It has a name. It's called a straw man. And the audience doesn't always catch it in real time because the response sounds like it's addressing the original point. It isn't. Then John shifts to Scripture. He brings up the historian Luke. He brings up scholars. He's building this case that the Bible is historically reliable, and that's a legitimate discussion. Historians genuinely do study ancient texts for reliability. But then he makes this move that I found fascinating. He points out that Richard's interpretation of the phrase, love your neighbor, came not from a theologian, but from an anesthesiologist. John Lennox actually says this out loud. And his point is that Richard didn't go to the right sources. Here's why that moment matters educationally. In historical and textual scholarship, sourcing actually does matter enormously. When you're making claims about what ancient texts mean, going to a subject matter expert versus a non-specialist genuinely changes the quality of the argument. John is not wrong about that principle. The problem is, he uses a legitimate academic point to avoid engaging with the actual substance of what Richard argued about Jesus and in-group morality. He corrects the source, but never fully dismantles the conclusion. And that is a pattern worth watching, because the strongest sounding arguments in a debate are sometimes the ones doing the most misdirection.
But finally, a word about miracles. This is a massive subject. You claim with David Hume that miracles violate the laws of nature. Well, David Hume's a very curious person to quote on this topic, because David Hume didn't believe really in the laws of cause and effect on which laws of nature are founded. He didn't believe in causality, and he didn't appear to believe in the principle of induction. And so that he's not a very good authority to quote. Secondly, I do not think that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, because the laws of nature describe what normally happens. God, who is the God of this universe and created it with its regularities, is perfectly at liberty to feed a new event into the universe. Just as C.S. Lewis makes a point, if I put $2 plus $2 in my desk tonight, $4. If I find in the morning is $1, I don't say that the laws of arithmetic have been broken. I say the laws of Alabama have been broken. And I call for a federal judge.
Well, the federal judge is going to ask that you continue your remarks with the understanding that you really are needing to conclude them within the next couple of minutes to give Professor Dawkins the last word. There is a broadcast audience. That is part of the reason for our time limits.
Were those meant to be my concluding remarks?
No, I'm giving you an extra minute or so
to make my concluding
to make
remarks.
your concluding remarks.
My final conclusion for the night.
Before giving the last word to Professor Dawkins.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been an interesting discussion. I'll have to make my remarks very briefly. I do not think the answer is atheism, though I agree with much of the criticism that Richard makes of religion. I think the book, The God Delusion, gives the game away in the dedication at the front of the book to Douglas Adams, where he says, isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too? Now, you do a brilliant job at getting rid of the fairies, though it must be said that most of them didn't believe in them anyway. But when you see the beauty of a garden, say in New College in Oxford, do you believe there's no gardener or no owner? That its sublime beauty has come about from raw nature by pure chance? Of course not. For gardens are to be distinguished from raw nature by the operation of intelligence. And what you're doing in your book, I think, is presenting us with an obviously false set of alternatives. Either we take gardens on their own or the garden plus fairies. But they don't appear on their own. They have gardeners and owners. So does the universe.
This is the part that blows my mind. Because John Lennox builds what sounds like a genuinely sophisticated framework and then uses it to arrive at a conclusion that raises more questions than it answers. He tackles miracles by saying they are not violations of the laws of nature. His argument is that the laws of nature simply describe what normally happens, and God, as the creator of those regularities, is free to introduce new events into the universe whenever he chooses. He even uses this analogy about putting money in a desk drawer overnight. If the amount changes by morning, you don't say arithmetic broke down, you say something external interfered. And I'll be honest, as an analogy, it's clever. It's genuinely well constructed. But here's the problem with it. The analogy assumes the existence of an agent who can interfere before proving that such an agent exists. You can't use the possibility of interference as evidence for the interferer. The conclusion is already buried inside the premise. And that's a foundational issue in logical reasoning that the analogy actually conceals rather than resolves. Think about it this way. If I told you something moved my keys overnight and then used the movement of the keys as proof that something moved them, I haven't explained anything. I've just restated the claim in a more confident tone. That's essentially what's happening here. Then John moves to what is probably his most emotionally resonant argument, the garden. He asks whether anyone could look at a beautifully maintained garden and genuinely believe it had no gardener, no owner, rather that it emerged from raw nature by pure chance. And he says, of course not. Gardens require intelligence. Therefore, the universe requires intelligence. Now, I want to be fair here. This line of reasoning has existed for centuries. It goes back to thinkers like William Paley in the 18th century, who used the now famous watchmaker analogy to make a similar case. And the reason it keeps appearing is because it genuinely feels compelling. When you look at complexity, the instinct to infer a designer is almost automatic in human psychology. But here's what people don't realize. Richard Dawkins has spent his entire career explaining precisely why that instinct, as powerful as it is, does not by itself constitute evidence. The feeling of design and the demonstrated fact of design are not the same thing. John ends this section by saying the universe has a gardener and an owner, and he delivers it with real conviction. But conviction alone has never been a substitute for demonstration.
You say there's no evidence of God, and yet your very description of the universe as a garden bears witness that the evidence is all around you. Atheism, ladies and gentlemen, is not only false, it contains no message that deals with the central problem of human rebellion against God. History is littered with attempts to build a godless utopia, each one of them based, as the book of Genesis suggests that they would be, on a denial that God has ever spoken or even that he exists. And I would remind you that the world that Richard Dawkins wishes to bring us to is no paradise except for the few. It denies the existence of good and evil. It even denies justice. But ladies and gentlemen, our hearts cry out for justice. And centuries ago, the Apostle Paul spoke to the philosophers of Athens and pointed out that there would be a day in which God would judge the world by the man that he had appointed, Jesus Christ, and that he'd given assurance to all people by raising him from the dead. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ, a miracle, something supernatural, for me constitutes the central evidence upon which I base my faith, not only that atheism is a delusion, but that justice is real and our sense of morality does not mock us. Because if there is no resurrection, if there is nothing after death, in the end, the terrorists and the fanatics have got away with it.
Okay. Thank you. Please. Professor Dawkins.
Yes, well, that concluding bit rather gives the game away, doesn't it? All that stuff about science and physics and the complications of physics and things, what it really comes down to is the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, there's a fundamental incompatibility between the sort of sophisticated scientist, which we hear part of the time from John Lennox, and it's impressive, and we are interested in the argument about multiverses and things, and then having produced some sort of a case for a kind of deistic God, perhaps, some God, the great physicist who adjusted the laws and constants of the universe. And that's all very grand and wonderful. And then suddenly we come down to the resurrection of Jesus. It's so petty, it's so trivial, it's so local, it's so earthbound, it's so unworthy of the universe.
This is where the entire conversation shifts. John Lennox spends his entire closing constructing what sounds like a comprehensive case. Morality, scripture, miracles, the garden. He builds it layer by layer, and it sounds like he's covered every angle. And then, right at the very end, he tells you what the whole structure was actually resting on. He says the resurrection of Jesus Christ constitutes the central evidence upon which he bases his faith. That's the foundation. That's what all of it leads to. And the moment Richard Dawkins gets the microphone, he identifies it immediately. He doesn't need to go back through every argument John made. He simply points to the foundation. And what follows is one of the most thought-provoking observations in this entire debate. Here's what makes it worth sitting with. John spent the earlier part of this exchange engaging with cosmological fine-tuning, Nobel Prize-winning scientists, the philosophy of David Hume. Multiverse theory, he constructed the image of a rigorous, scientifically literate thinker wrestling with the deepest questions of existence. And then, at the conclusion, the single piece of central evidence offered for the intelligence behind a universe that is nearly 14 billion years old, containing an estimated 2 trillion galaxies across 93 billion light-years of space, is one specific event in one specific location on one specific planet. Richard Dawkins frames this as a question of proportionality, and that framing is what makes it so intellectually striking. He is not dismissing the sincerity of the belief. He is asking whether the scale of the explanation matches the scale of what it is supposed to explain. That gap between the vastness of the cosmos and the locality of the evidence being offered is the core of his argument, and it is a genuinely interesting question that does not have an easy answer. This is the moment where the entire structure John built gets examined at its foundation. Not brick by brick, but at the single load-bearing wall underneath everything else. And once you see what that wall is, the conversation looks completely different. So, what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.